So the thing that apparently broke King Charles wasn't a public scandal, wasn't a family fracture playing out in the tabloids, wasn't even the weight of the crown itself. It was one sentence delivered by an archivist in a locked room at Windsor confirming that his mother, the late Queen Elizabeth, had secretly renamed the Balmoral Trust and placed Prince William at the center of its future. And when his signature was authenticated, Charles didn't argue, he didn't demand a review, he just stopped speaking. That detail alone tells you everything about how deep this cut, because this wasn't a bureaucratic shuffle. This was his mother from beyond the grave legally restructuring control of the most private, emotionally significant royal estate, away from the reigning monarch and into the hands of the next generation. Before we get into what this actually means for the family, take a second to subscribe to Crown Watch so you don't miss these updates. Now picture the scene. Charles has one hand pressed against the page as the senior archivist explains what's been authenticated. The Balmoral Trust was the legal structure controlling how the estate, its protected rooms, and its private records would be managed. We're not talking about a sentimental letter left in a drawer. This amendment carried witness signatures, formal instructions, and legal weight designed to shape decisions long after the Queen was gone. Then the archivist delivers the line that changes everything. Queen Elizabeth II had legally renamed and restructured the arrangement as the Balmoral Continuity Trust, placing William, not the King, at the center of its future stewardship. The new terms gave the prince decisive authority over alterations, over archives, over private spaces, and over who in the family got access to what. Charles read the paragraph again. Then he lowered the document and asked, "Why did my mother never tell me?" And nobody answered. That question hanging in the silence is the whole story. Honestly, Balmoral was never just property to Charles. It was childhood summers, it was memory, it was the fading presence of a mother whose approval he spent a lifetime trying to secure. And what that silence revealed was harsher than any argument they ever had. The Queen wanted the estate protected from becoming the personal instrument of whatever reigning household happened to be in power, including her own sons. William got the news through a documented archive briefing confirmed in a recorded call with the chief trustee, and by all accounts, he didn't feel any triumph. How could he? The decision raised his authority, but it also exposed the final judgment about his father's leadership. The future king understood immediately that accepting this role would wound Charles deeply, but refusing it would betray the grandmother who had chosen him. That's an impossible position to be put in, and the Queen put him there deliberately. The archivist explained the amendment had been signed months before the monarch died, witnessed by 2 independent trustees, and sealed with handwritten instructions. It couldn't even be opened until a succession review was completed, which is this formal check of documents that happens after one reign ends and another begins. So this was sitting there waiting the entire time Charles was adjusting to being king. Then Charles turned to the archive register and saw something else. A second sealed envelope waiting beneath the trust papers addressed jointly to him and William. So he's just discovered what his mother did, but before he can understand why she did it, he has to face the son who inherited the power she chose not to leave him. That's the moment the story really starts. Now, to understand why this hit Charles so hard, you have to understand what Balmoral actually represents. It was never just stone and land and royal property. To Charles, it carried childhood memories, private disappointments, and that fading presence of a mother whose approval he could never quite lock down. To William, it represented duty without escape, and now the same estate had become a silent verdict sitting between them. One man felt displaced, the other felt burdened, and neither had asked for this. The Queen's decision wasn't administrative. Charles removed his glasses and stared toward the window, hearing the archivist's voice replaying in his mind. Camilla watched him struggle to breathe through the humiliation. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away, not in anger at her, but because comfort in that moment would make the pain real. Balmoral had been one of the few places where the king could remember being a son before becoming sovereign, before becoming the reigning monarch responsible for everything. Losing control there felt less like an administrative change and more like a rejection from the one person whose approval mattered most. Meanwhile, William is waiting outside the Windsor sitting room with a sentence prepared in his head, something respectful that he realized was completely wrong the moment he thought it. He folded the note, slipped it into his pocket, and entered without it. His bond with Balmoral was about family continuity, memories of his grandmother, and the hope that Catherine, George, Charlotte, and Louis could inherit stability rather than another royal battleground. That's why the decision mattered so much. It protected more than rooms. It protected how the family would remember itself. The trust didn't make William Balmoral's owner. Instead, it gave him the controlling voice over preservation, archival access, alterations, ceremonial use, and which royal household could occupy protected areas. Archival access, just to be clear, means permission to view historic papers or sealed records. Ceremonial use covers official gatherings held on the estate. So, the power was narrow in legal terms, but its emotional force was enormous. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Catherine's name deepened the shock. A supporting clause listed her as continuity advisor, a role designed to guide family use and preservation at disputes emerged. The Queen hadn't only chosen her grandson, she had placed confidence in the entire family unit he built. William understood the honor immediately, but he also understood the wound this would open in his father. Charles stood beside the table holding the unsigned acknowledgement form, the document confirming that he accepted the trust as authority. William stepped closer, searching his father's face for anger and finding something worse. Hurt. The king didn't greet him, didn't offer a chair. He tightened his grip on the paper and asked only, "How long did you know?" The accusation was quiet, but the wound behind it had been forming for years, and its true beginning lay in one forgotten confrontation at Balmoral that the palace tried very hard to bury. The Queen's decision didn't emerge from confusion or fading strength. It began during one specific summer evening when Balmoral's future was discussed behind closed doors, and the conversation ended with Elizabeth staring at a set of renovation plans she had never approved. The people present would later remember the silence more than the argument. It was the silence of a monarch realizing the home she guarded might change the moment she was gone. Charles had entered that summer convinced that modernization would protect Balmoral. He wanted working spaces and rooms prepared for official guests. William resisted because the estate's private character mattered to him. Its value came from remaining a family refuge, rather than becoming another extension of palace business. The Queen understood both arguments, but she feared historic rooms, family papers, and traditions could disappear into the operational control of the next reigning household, meaning the staff and offices serving whichever monarch came next. The turning point came during a private planning meeting. Charles opened a folder proposing that part of Elizabeth's secluded West Wing become guest accommodation and administrative space. He spoke of efficiency and future needs. His mother listened without interrupting. Then she closed the folder, pushed it back across the table, and said, "Not while my memories are still in those rooms." Charles heard resistance to his future reign. The Queen heard something more dangerous in his persistence. Proof that sentiment might be sacrificed once authority passed to him. Neither raised a voice. Yet that quiet exchange became the point of no return, because Balmoral was no longer simply an estate plan. It had become a test of whether one reign could rewrite the private world of another. William found his grandmother later beside an unlit fireplace, still carrying the hurt of that meeting. She asked whether preservation could survive without becoming punishment. The prince answered carefully, promising that protecting the past should never be used to shame the living. Her question stayed with him because she wasn't asking about furniture or rooms. She was asking whether memory could remain safe after power changed hands. Within days, Elizabeth contacted independent trustees and ordered a confidential governance review, a formal examination of who would control Balmoral and how that power could be limited. A documented archive account confirmed she excluded Charles's household in the usual palace chain of command. Her handwritten notes carried one warning. Balmoral must serve the continuity of the crown, not the preferences of whoever temporarily wore it. Charles discovered the review and demanded it be stopped. The past had finally entered the room with him. And when Charles looked at William, he was no longer seeing only his heir. He was seeing the man his mother had trusted to restrain him. So now we're at the confrontation. No advisors, no private secretaries, no carefully drafted palace language. Only a father, a son, and the unsigned documents separating them. Charles began with restraint, but restraint couldn't survive the question that had haunted him since the archive meeting. He didn't ask whether the trust was lawful. He didn't ask whether William would accept it. He asked whether the Queen had trusted her grandson more than her own son. Charles had ordered the Windsor sitting room closed with instructions that no aide could enter unless summoned. William stood across from him, carrying no notes, offering no rehearsed defense. Between them lay the acknowledgement form, the document requiring the monarch to formally accept the trust authority. Signing it wouldn't remove his crown, but it would feel like admitting his mother had deliberately placed a limit around him. The king pushed the paper forward. "Did she trust you more than me?" he asked. William pulled out a chair but didn't sit. The prince refused to hide behind legal phrases because the question wasn't about law. It was about a son who had waited decades for his mother's confidence and now feared she had given its final measure to someone else. William said he had never requested the role. Carrying the Queen's decision felt less like an inheritance than a warning, because every choice he made could deepen the wound between them. Charles heard the humility, but he also heard something harder. His heir would not surrender the authority simply to protect his father's pride. Then William revealed the source of his resolve. During a private recorded conversation at Balmoral, Elizabeth had told him the estate needed a guardian prepared to say no to the sovereign. The word sovereign meant the reigning monarch, the person who held the crown. Her meaning was unmistakable. She hadn't created this restriction by accident. Charles finally broke his own silence. He admitted that he had discovered the confidential review before his mother's death and tried to return Balmoral to ordinary royal control. He believed independent trustees weakened the monarchy by placing family property beyond the direct command of the king. The monarch lifted his pen, and for one breath William believed he would sign. Instead, Charles set it down so sharply that it rolled from the table and fell to the carpet. Neither man moved. William spoke again. The trust allowed its controlling trustee to freeze alterations already approved for Balmoral. One of those projects belonged to Camilla. And just like that, the conflict was no longer confined to a mother's judgment of her son. It was about to enter the Queen Consort's household and expose who truly held power inside Balmoral's walls. Royal authority often appears absolute from the outside, but the Queen's final arrangement had been designed around one unsettling principle. Even a monarch could be restrained. Beneath the ceremonial language was a mechanism colder and stronger than family loyalty. William could freeze changes, independent trustees could reject pressure, protected rooms could remain sealed, and as Camilla discovered, when her household's request was returned unsigned, the Crown itself could no longer force Balmoral to obey. Camilla read the return proposal twice before removing her glasses. Her secretary waited in silence as the Queen Consort asked whether Charles had seen it. The refusal concerned a private Balmoral suite she had hoped to refurbish, but the rejection carried a deeper message. The Balmoral Continuity Trust was governed by William as principal family trustee, an independent estate administrator, and a senior archival guardian. A trustee is someone legally required to protect property for its intended purpose, not personal preference. The structure blocked any single household from taking complete control. Major alterations, the removal of historic contents, entry into sealed rooms, and changes to long-standing family use required the prince's approval alongside independent verification. That safeguard mattered because Balmoral held private records and spaces tied directly to the late monarch's final years. Once altered, those memories could never be fully restored. Camilla felt humiliated, but not simply because she had lost a room. Elizabeth's design placed her outside the line of decision-making at the estate where she and Charles expected to shape their own legacy. The Queen Consort folded the rejection and asked her secretary to leave. When the door closed, she remained seated, understanding that the late sovereign had created a system specifically strong enough to resist her husband. William felt no satisfaction. He told Catherine during a documented private conversation that enforcing the trust could make him appear to challenge his father's reign. She reminded him that accepting authority while refusing its responsibilities would betray the Queen more deeply. The future king couldn't claim loyalty to his grandmother and then ignore the protection she had built. The rejected project carried another shock. It would have altered rooms connected to Elizabeth's final Balmoral meetings, including the sitting room where she made some of her last private decisions. A hidden continuity clause then made the restriction absolute. No reigning monarch, consort, future consort, or household official could dissolve the trust or reclaim sole authority over protected areas. Charles learned that William had already suspended the plans. Furious and wounded, the king called an emergency family meeting. He still believed the force of the crown could rally the family behind him, but the first voice raised in that meeting would not defend the king. It would defend the woman who had bound his hands. The meeting was supposed to restore control. Instead, it revealed how little control remained. Charles entered, expecting the family to recognize the danger of allowing an heir to overrule a sovereign. William entered, prepared to defend a decision he had never sought. Camilla carried the sting of exclusion. Catherine carried the weight of keeping her husband calm. Then Princess Anne spoke, and with one sentence, the room understood that the Queen's final safeguard would not be easily broken. Charles gathered William, Catherine, Camilla, Anne, Edward, and Sophie for an emergency discussion about the trust's legality, the suspended renovations, and the damage now spreading through the family. The king argued that divided authority created instability. A sovereign was the reigning monarch, and in his view, no heir should possess the power to block that monarch inside a royal estate. William answered that the trust existed precisely because temporary wishes could destroy permanent heritage. Anne listened without interrupting. Then she placed both hands on the table and faced her brother. Mommy did not fear the crown. She said she feared what grief and impatience might make us do with it. Charles turned toward his sister in disbelief. Her refusal to support him changed everything. This was no longer only a struggle between father and son. It had become a family judgment on how he carried loss and power. Camilla broke the silence by asking whether she was expected to live as a guest in every room connected to Elizabeth. Catherine chose her words carefully. She said dignity was not the same as control, and respect did not require rewriting another woman's private world. The Queen Consort stiffened. The princess remained calm, but William heard the warning beneath her restraint. Edward then confirmed through a documented family account that the Queen had discussed preservation with him months before her death. She feared Balmoral would become too official and lose the privacy that made it sacred. His statement proved William hadn't manipulated an isolated decision. Sophie added another revelation sourced from her recorded private conversation with Elizabeth. The late monarch had asked whether Catherine could protect Balmoral's traditions without using them to humiliate Camilla. She had anticipated this exact pain. She had also trusted the trusted confidant to remember her concern. Charles pushed back his chair before anyone formally ended the meeting. The sharp scrape silenced the room. He left the acknowledgement form behind. That night, William found it folded outside his private room, across the front. His father had written, "Meet me alone at Balmoral." The family had failed to reconcile them, so father and son would return to the place at the center of the wound without advisors, titles, or anyone else to absorb the truth. At Balmoral, the argument changed shape. There were no trustees waiting outside, no family members choosing sides, no palace officials measuring every word. Charles and William sat in the Queen's old private sitting room, where one chair remained exactly where she had left it. For the first time, the king stopped defending his authority. He looked at the empty place beside the fireplace and admitted that the trust had forced him to confront something far more painful than losing control. William had arrived expecting another demand to surrender the power placed at his hands. Instead, he found his father alone with no secretaries, no documents, no prepared defense. The protected sitting room was one of the spaces frozen from alteration under the Balmoral Continuity Trust, meaning its contents couldn't be changed without formal approval. That mattered because the room held more than furniture. It carried the final habits and private memories of the late monarch. Charles rested one hand on the back of his mother's empty chair. He admitted that he had spent decades preparing to inherit the crown, yet never prepared to lose her confidence. The king could accept criticism from ministers, from newspapers, even from his own family. What he could not easily accept was the thought that Elizabeth believed him capable of ruling the country, but unable to protect its most intimate royal inheritance. William listened without interrupting. Then the prince told him the trust was not a declaration that he was unworthy. A sovereign was the reigning monarch surrounded by pressure from advisors, public duty, and personal grief. The queen had understood that such power sometimes needed someone close enough to resist it without trying to destroy it. She hadn't chosen a rival. She had chosen a safeguard. Charles finally produced the second sealed envelope. Together they opened it under the conditions recorded in the archive register. Elizabeth's documented letter explained that William needed to learn stewardship before sovereignty, the duty of protecting something before possessing greater power. She also wrote that Charles needed freedom from turning every family, object, and room into a test of whether his reign was respected. The letter carried one final command. William must preserve his father's dignity, consult him on major decisions, and never use the trust to punish Camilla. The future king read that passage twice, then promised he would obey it. Charles asked for the acknowledgement form. William placed it on the desk beneath the letter. The king signed. By morning, however, the trust's existence had leaked beyond the palace. Father and son had finally understood the queen's intention, but the world outside Balmoral would see only a king restrained, an heir empowered, and a family secret exposed. By sunrise, the private settlement had become a national spectacle. Broadcasters spoke of a king overruled from beyond the grave. Commentators called William the keeper of Elizabeth's true legacy. Others saw family wound being turned into public entertainment. One image captured the mood more powerfully than any debate. Charles and William leaving Balmoral together while crowds waited beyond the gates, uncertain whether they had witnessed a royal defeat or a reconciliation. Charles watched the television coverage without sound. News of the renamed Balmoral Continuity Trust had escaped after details from the archival confirmation circulated beyond the restricted estate team. Palace communications now faced a dangerous choice. Denying the trust was impossible, while explaining its full purpose would expose the private conflict between the king, his son, and the late queen's final wishes. A major morning newspaper delivered the blow in enormous letters: the Queen's last choice, William given Balmoral control. Beneath the headline appeared separate photographs of the monarch looking solemn, and the prince arriving at the estate. The wording made the decision sound like a victory for one man and a humiliation for another. That framing mattered because public faith in the monarchy depended on continuity, not the appearance of two rival centers of power. Camilla sat beside Charles and asked whether the palace statement should challenge the claim that his mother had rejected him. The queen consort wanted to protect him, but she also understood how deeply the headline had cut. He answered that defending his pride would damage Elizabeth's purpose. The king had finally understood the trust in private. Now he had to prove that understanding in public. William felt equally trapped. Commentators praised him as though he had defeated his father, but the future king knew that accepting such a victory would destroy the reconciliation they had just reached. Catherine urged him to appear beside Charles. She reminded her husband that the country needed to seek continuity rather than conquest, because silence would allow the most damaging version of the story to harden. The palace released a joint statement confirming that the trust protected Balmoral's historic and private character. A joint statement is an official message issued in more than one person's name, showing shared agreement. It also confirmed that father and son would consult each other on the estate's future. Crowds gathered near Balmoral's entrance. One woman held a handwritten sign reading, "Protect her home, protect the family." Others applauded quietly as the royal cars passed. Charles and William then walked out together. The king briefly placed a hand against his son's back, and the gesture changed the coverage at once. The cameras captured reconciliation. But the true verdict would come only when the king decided whether to treat his mother's restriction as humiliation or as the final guidance she had left him. In the end, the renamed trust didn't destroy Charles's authority, didn't crown William before his time, didn't divide Balmoral between rival courts. It forced 3 generations of monarchy into one final reckoning. Elizabeth had protected the past. Charles had to accept a boundary. William had to carry power without celebrating it. What first appeared to be a devastating rejection became something more demanding. A final lesson that love, stewardship, and monarchy survive only when authority is willing to restrain itself. Charles formally recognized the Balmoral Continuity Trust and ordered his household to withdraw every renovation request affecting protected rooms and private archives. The trust was the legal structure created to preserve the estate beyond the wishes of one reigning household. His decision mattered because it ended the threat of another family battle and proved that the king would not use the crown to erase his mother's final safeguard. William accepted the role of principal trustee, the family member with the strongest responsibility for enforcing the arrangement, but only after securing full consultation for his father on ceremonial and family use decisions. The prince refused to turn stewardship into victory. He understood that protecting Balmoral also meant protecting Charles from public humiliation. The king returned alone to Elizabeth's sitting room and placed the acknowledgement pen back on the desk where he had signed. He no longer saw the preserved space as evidence of exclusion. He saw a responsibility he had almost misunderstood. Later, Charles told Camilla that Balmoral would never become a monument against them. The queen consort withdrew her household's disputed plans and accepted another suite outside the protected wing. William froze unnecessary alterations, appointed an independent administrator, and guaranteed continued family access. Catherine then helped create a family use protocol, a clear set of rules based on consultation rather than rank. Anne, Edward, Sophie, and future generations would remain connected without allowing one household to dominate the estate. Elizabeth's purpose was finally clear. She hadn't divided authority to declare one man worthy and another defeated. She feared something quieter than scandal, the slow rewriting of memory by whoever temporarily held power. Charles had been devastated because the trust exposed the limit of his mother's confidence. Yet by accepting that limit without retaliation, he showed the restraint she feared might be missing. William didn't inherit Balmoral as a prize. He inherited the duty to protect the estate, his father, and the family from a conflict that could have consumed them. There would be no reversal, no hidden challenge, no final battle for Balmoral. The Queen's decision stood. Charles accepted it, and William became the guardian she had chosen.